Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. The Signpost webinar series is brought to you in association with the National Rural Network, Food Drink Ireland, and Dairy Sustainability Ireland. The Department of Agriculture and the Marine has recently published a draft strategy for the agri-food sector. The 2030 Agri-Food Strategy aims to set Ireland on a trajectory to become a world leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade. The strategy aims to deliver significant benefits for the Irish agri-food sector itself, for the Irish society and the environment. And we're delighted to be joined by Tom Arnold, who is independent chair of the 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee this morning on this morning's webinar. So Tom, you're very welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Tom, before we get to your presentation, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work, I suppose, how you came to become chair of this strategy group, and maybe a little bit about your background and maybe some context to the overall process.
Okay, thank you. And firstly, to say, just it is a real pleasure to have this chance to talk to a Teagasc organised event. Teagasc has, and the advisory service has played an important part in my life. I spent 5 years as economist with then ACOT in 1983 to 88, before it became Teagasc. And I have very fond memories of that. You're coming today from Athenry. I recall some of the great people dealt with in Athenry, people like Johnny Wiersky, Pat Mahan, Bernard O'Farrell, Bernie Smith, and all great colleagues and also great friends. So it's a real pleasure from there to join you. I don't imagine there's too many people in the audience who worked with me in ACOT stroke Teagasc 33 years ago. Pat Murphy is one of them. But I went from there to the Department of Agriculture, where I as chief economist and then assistant secretary, I moved from there to Concern, where I was for 13 years till I retired in 2013. It seems I've got busier since I retired, and I've done a variety of different things. And one of the last things is indeed to chair this session. I mean, why I was asked to chair it is for somebody else to decide. But basically, I suppose I have a wide range of experience at both European and international and national level. Hopefully that impacted on the decision. Anyway, it's been a great pleasure. It was a group of 32 people for the committee, the 2030 committee, and we've worked steadily to produce that. So what I would like to do today, if I can move to the presentation, is to go through, indeed, talk briefly at the beginning about the process by which we went about our work. I just want to talk about the structure of the presentation that I have today. I hope it'll take about 25 minutes. And then I very much welcome the chance to talk, to have questions and exchange of views. I thought it was useful maybe at the very beginning, on one slide, just talk about what I think are turning point moments over the last 50 years. I'll briefly deal with that and then go on to the strategy itself. In terms of reference, what we were asked to do, the process by which we went about it, what are the key recommendations? We've basically decided to set out what we would call 4 missions, high-level missions, and goals, subsidiary policy goals to attain those missions. And then go towards the end of the presentation towards what I was asked to talk about, the environmental ambition. And I want to put it in a wider international context where Ireland's 2030 Agri-Food Strategy fits into this wider context, particularly into the context of the Food Systems Summit that's coming up later in the year. So next slide, please. If I go back to what over this long period of time where I've been following these things, I think these are the really important moments over the last 50 years where change happened, either through politics or policy. And basically that's reset the world that something like Teagasc was going to have to adapt to. Ireland's entry to the EEC, obviously of major importance. The EU milk quota in '84 The first day I came into my new job in ACOT in 1983, the director, Liam Downey, said to me, I want you to come up with what should our policy be towards a milk quota. We didn't have a milk quota at that stage, but it came shortly afterwards, and it remained, of course, then up until 2015. A big moment was definitely the reform, the CAP reform in 1982. It came into effect in 1983, but that meant basically from a price to income support. That was the big change. Up till then, you had a price support, which gave rise to beef mountains, butter mountains, etc., etc. It wasn't sustainable. It had to change. When it did happen, it meant that in the Department of Agriculture at the time, there had a major shift towards enabling farmers to be paid, their direct payments. And I can tell you the level of political pressure to deliver that was quite something at the time. And then we saw over the subsequent years a CAP as it became more complex, increasing focus on the agri-environment, food safety, animal welfare, rural development, all that. And then another moment of really great significance, and particularly for Ireland, the abolition of the quota in 2015. But subsequent to that, we're beginning to gear up towards another reform of the CAP. And that was done following a Europe-wide public consultation 2018-2019, and out of that a very clear statement from the Commission that we were heading towards a greener CAP in the future, and that was further emphasized by the big decision in December 2019 that Europe was going for what European Green Deal, a clear commitment that Europe was going to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And for the agriculture sector particularly, there were two subsidiary strategies, the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy. And so my contention is that we have reached another turning point moment now in terms of public policy. And it is around sustainability. So it wasn't any surprise that we were given that as the center of our terms of reference. And that's what we've attempted to deliver. So we're being pushed in this direction, but not just by politics and policy. We're being pushed by the marketplace. And all around the 2030 committee, we had members of the processing sector and the people who are charged with selling Irish food. And they came with a very simple message. It is sustainability that we have to deliver. The journey, how we went about it, was that we were given that terms of reference, develop a vision, etc., to ensure the economic, environmental, and social sustainability of the sector. 32-person committee. We started our work in November. We really, in effect, started it in January of 2020. And then not too long afterwards, COVID came along. So we only had 3 actual face-to-face meetings. The rest was done by Zoom. And we got to the point where we were able to publish a draft strategy on the 17th of April. And it wasn't just a draft 2030 strategy, which I'll be talking about in a bit more detail. There is, if you like, companion documents, an environmental report, which is assessing the environmental implications of what we are recommending in the strategy, and also another document called an appropriate assessment, which is looking at some of the nature-based EU schemes and looking at the impact of those. So let's look to the strategy in its historical context. It is the fifth such strategy since 2020. You're probably familiar with some of the others, but more recently, the more recent ones, Food Harvest 2020, Foodwise 2025. Each of these strategies, I think, have been of their time. The Food Harvest 2020 really anticipated even though it came out around 2010, it anticipated that there would be an abolition of the milk quota. And that gave a policy framework for people beginning to plan for that day when that happened. Foodwise 2025 was really focusing on how the sector could grow the value and the value added of what it produced. But there was in Foodwise 2025 a really important statement, and it said it was a guiding principle that environmental protection and economic competitiveness are equal and complementary. One will not be achieved at the expense of the other. Well, now that's not quite what happened. What happened was that indeed Foodwise 2025 delivered in terms of increased output, the value of exports and value added, but at the expense of the environment. And the EPA, very clear statement on that, the economic growth in recent years has occurred at the expense of the environment, as witnessed by the negative trends in water quality, greenhouse gas emissions, ammonia emissions, and biodiversity. So we also need to look at the strategy against the background of changing Irish climate policy. I think it is true to say that from 2010 onwards, Irish climate policy steadily lost credibility nationally and internationally, and there were ratings and published documents to support that. The thing that got political attention was the Taoiseach's admission in 2018 that Ireland was a climate laggard. And then at a more substantial moment was the Supreme Court judgment in July 2020, which said that the 2017 National Mitigation Plan was inadequate, essentially, and it had to be upgraded. So what the government, that actually coincided, of course, with a new government, with involving the Green Party, with a new program for government, which very clearly said there was needed to be increased ambition. And then that has been taken a step further by the Climate Action Amendment Bill, which provides for the setting of 5-year carbon budgets for each economic sector to force a reduction in emissions. The wider international background, of course, is also a factor here. I mean, there's been, following on from the European Green Deal, there's been actually decisions to heighten the level of ambition within European climate policy. And then obviously more recently, the arrival of Joe Biden in the White House has also moved in that same direction. So what, in terms of when we sat down effectively in January of 2020 to work towards producing a new strategy, we were informed by what has been happening internationally in more recent years, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, the acknowledgement that there is a connection between food, health, and the environment. And that has evolved into what's been called a food systems approach. And that was the approach that we decided at the beginning that we would take in framing our strategy. Now, just to be clear what this means in practical terms, it means that we would look to an explicit link being made between selected aspects of policies for food, for health, and for the environment, and also that we would attempt to think through the roles and responsibilities of all the main actors in the food chain and spell that out as we work towards a vision for a sustainable food system for 2030. I mean, there has been a tendency in the past to think about food strategies as being predominantly focused on what's happening within the farm gate. Our strategy is a very clear statement that if we're going for sustainability, everyone from the input supplier to the farmer, to the processor, to the retailer, to the citizen, to the consumer, all have a role to play in working towards a sustainable food system. So moving to the next slide then, we can see that the other critical thing, of course, to say is that the context within which we have we were developing our strategy was radically different than the context within which Foodwise 2025 was framed. And I mean, the main elements of that change context were that the role of the agri-environment had become much more important politically, that there are clear consumer preferences about sustainably produced food, and many of the big food companies, whether national or international, are each following their own sustainability agendas for 2030, and that's being reflected into the demands of the people who supply them. At the more macro level, the 4 major, what we call shaping issues for the next decade, we concluded were the evolving global food economy, increased population, increased middle-class people who can afford more high-quality food, planning within human and planetary boundaries, that sense that clearly there has to be more significant action on the environment if we are to tackle the climate change problem, Brexit and its consequences, and then the thing that wasn't there when we started our work, COVID, but obviously COVID is there and COVID has to be thought about. So they were, if you like, the major shaping factors that we have that influenced how we analyze the future and what we wrote about it. The actual strategy report itself, it's a long document, it's over 140 pages, and the other two supplementary documents are also long documents. So not everyone is going to have read it. Anyone who has read it probably have focused on the executive summary. So this is the structure of the report: a foreword by me at the beginning, an executive summary, which is about 15 pages, and then setting the scene, the introduction and context, and then the four missions. These are the four high-level policy directions that we believe are necessary in order to achieve this vision of a sustainable food system in the future. And first, not surprisingly, is a very substantial chapter on a climate-smart, environmentally sustainable sector. Second, viable and resilient primary producers with enhanced well-being. There was, I think, a very clear sense around the table from farming representatives that the other strategies, while they had achieved their aims in terms of increasing exports and value added, et cetera, that hadn't adequately reflected back to the welfare of farmers. And so that was the basis for a very clear decision, I think, that we needed to put that issue of viable and resilient primary producers with enhanced well-being, as being central to this strategy. Then the issue of food that is safe, nutritious, and appealing, trusted at home and abroad. I think there's a very good quality chapter there. And then finally, this idea, an innovative, competitive, and resilient sector driven by technology and talent. That's all about the whole world of agri-tech that Teagasc is doing a lot of good work in, the whole world of the bioeconomy, etc. So these were the four chapters, with each of them having particular actions, policy recommendations essentially attached to each of them. And that's what we have done. And then we've a final chapter, which is hugely important, I think, implementation arrangements. Because there has to be, we say that there's policy on its own, unless it's implemented, isn't going to be much good. And within that, for example, there is a recommendation that an environmental oversight committee should be there, basically to see if things are not moving in the right direction, that's spotted early enough and acted upon. So what are the key recommendations then? Firstly, we really did attempt to meet our terms of reference to policy to deliver economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And each of them, in their own right, I think in the past, you could argue that, environmental objectives were set down but not delivered upon. In the past, I think there wasn't the adequate emphasis on social sustainability. So we've tried to acknowledge that each of these in their own right are important, but also that they can't be judged or thought about in a compartmentalized way. There is an important interplay between them. And if you look through the whole report, working towards each dimension of sustainability draws on policies across the four missions. There is a really important issue here about how if you set out a target, how you begin to work towards that target. And here, again, I'm using for the next few slides quotations from the report, which I think are really relevant. And this is one of them. The issue of policy sequencing, timeframes for implementing policy, and the use of the just transition approach will be important. There are trade-offs between the different dimensions of sustainability. These need to be acknowledged and a willingness shown to reach realistic compromises on the direction of change and the speed at which it can take place. And the strategy sets out the agenda from which such choices and decisions can be made. It's very important to say this. The strategy is, if you like, a policy framework. It's not the last word on anything really, but it's a framework within which we propose we should be working towards. There's going to be supplementary decisions of a more detailed nature, which are going to have to be taken along the way. The strategy's big idea, and this is, I think, it's in line with the world we're living in, but I think it almost to some extent it's making a virtue out of necessity. The strategy's central objective is that Ireland should become an international leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade. This is not something that you can turn a switch and it can be achieved overnight. This is a process, and it's a challenging process. But we do start by saying that we recognize there needs to be a profound shift towards more sustainable policies and actions nationally and internationally. If we can achieve that shift, then this is what you see on the screen here is where we hope to get to. The future source of competitive advantage for the Irish agri-food sector lies in being able to demonstrate that it can meet the highest standards of sustainability in all its forms, not just environmental, such that it can be considered among the world leaders in the field. And that's the basis on which we can hopefully gain market share and in some cases gain a premium price for what we sell. That is not an easy task, gaining a premium price in world food markets, but if we are to have any chance of doing it, it's on the basis of our sustainability credentials. If that does happen for us, what will it mean in terms of the shape of the sector? And we look to the next slide now. It's going to have to mean big changes for the sector, and help and in association with government and with society. But there's one clear statement that is going to have to be achieved. The sector should aim to become climate neutral by 2050, with verifiable progress by 2030, encompassing emissions, biodiversity, and water quality. At a more practical level, the sector becomes more diversified, resilient, and based on circular economy principles. And this is important, the core of Ireland's agri-food output will continue to be grass-based livestock production, wherein lies Ireland's natural advantage. And we will obviously continue to look at selling into an increasingly diversified range of export markets, and hopefully to get a premium price. Coming to almost coming back to our terms of reference, restatement about the centrality of working towards economic, environmental, and social sustainability. You can read that there. I just I'd be talking a bit more about Acclimatize and how it connects to the overall vision for the future. But on the social sustainability, the reality that we should be setting this strategy in that wider context of a stronger national focus on rural and regional development. So the other national report published in recent weeks on rural development really has to be seen as a companion document to our document, because I think there's going to be more possibility in the post-COVID world of people working at home. There's going to be changes in work patterns, the importance of effective broadband right across the country, more important. So I think there is a coherence in terms of national policy between what we are saying in the 2030 strategy and some of the other things that are happening. There's also at another level, this strategy, I think, has brought an innovation, as we see on the next slide, where we talk about policy coherence. And whereas we had talked in Foodwise 2025, for example, about both economic and environmental sustainability, this strategy is the first to make a direct connection with health policy. And it proposes that the issue of food and health should be brought to a new level of political and policy importance. But this is going to require both a whole of government and a whole of society approach. And I think when we get through this COVID crisis, I think that would be a fitting moment to have a national conversation about health policy generally, but specifically about food and health. At a practical level, we're proposing that there should be a high-level group between the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and the Department of Health to work in areas where they're already working in, but it should be given an additional momentum. Areas such as Healthy Ireland, the National Obesity Strategy, and the One Health, One World approach. And then an area which obviously I'm particularly interested in, the need to have a policy coherence between what we're doing at home and what we're doing in our foreign and development policy. I now want to move, as we're coming to the end of this presentation, to the issue of the environmental ambition. Mission 1 on climate smart, environmentally sustainable agri-food sector and the 7 goals reflects the political and policy importance of this issue. We still await the establishment of a 5-year carbon budget for the sector. And in the absence of that, we couldn't in our strategy propose a detailed plan for the delivery of a carbon neutral sector by 2050. But what we have indicated are certain parameters, policy directions and milestones. And one important statement in that regard is from Ag Climatize, where it says that it's clear that an increase in the national cattle herd above current levels would jeopardize the achievement of climate neutrality by 2050. So what we have done in our strategy is set a series of what are challenging targets for emissions, water quality and biodiversity for 2030. But our strategy does not resolve what the respective roles of beef and dairying should be in working towards those targets. And we are suggesting that a separate additional process will have to be undertaken, looking at the respective environmental footprints of beef and dairy sector in working towards those 2030 targets, and that process to be completed by Q2 of 2022. The immediate implementation of Ag Climatize is obviously a high priority. And it is clear that Ag Climatize will have to be updated to ensure consistency with new targets which are emerging either nationally or internationally. And the 5-year carbon budget in particular is going to be of relevance there. We are signaling that we are going to move towards, over the next decade, more carbon farming. I mean, if the world needs to deal with the climate crisis, and if the agri-food sector as one of the critical sectors which can contribute to solving that problem through increased sequestration, it's going to have a policy framework and incentives to enable it to do that. And what we are suggesting in our strategy is that this work has to proceed, it has to accelerate, in fact, and in fact, other areas such as forestry and renewable energy have to come into play to a much greater extent. I'm almost at the end. I have 2 slides left to attempt to capture what this whole presentation has been about. And it's this, that we are proposing policies which have actually a high ambition of Ireland becoming a world leader in sustainable food systems. But it's important to set it as the background, if you like, that producing sustainable food is now, it's a basic entry point. The challenge for us as a country is whether we can build a sustainable food system that can actually become a source of strategic competitive advantage. And if that can be done, that's the basis for transferring prices back to better prices back to the farmer. It's important to note that Ireland is actually the only country that has developed its current national agri-food strategy using a food systems approach. So there's very considerable interest in what we've done. There's a great deal of work going on in preparing for the Food Systems Summit in September, and Ireland is playing a really important role in that work. There's a lot of very good collaboration between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Foreign Affairs in preparing for this, and in positioning ourselves so that we can say we have actually something quite important and quite unique in our planning for the future. And then my final slide is that I think we have taken in the strategy, we've taken, I think, a very realistic view of the decade ahead. But the overall sense and feeling of our report is positive and will highlight significant opportunities for Ireland. And if that can be achieved, we believe that can deliver both economic benefits, which can be ultimately translated down to the farmer, and political benefits. And coming back to, if you like, the 50-year perspective of how the world changes, I think if we can get into this leadership position in the sustainable food systems, it really will open the door to the next stage of transformation and value addition in the sector. And anyone who's tracked it, and many of you will have done, we've moved from being a producer of commodity products up until the 1990s to being currently an internationally competitive food sector, but we can build on that to become, I think, a leading supplier of policy advice and services to countries on track to developing their own version of a sustainable food system. And Africa in particular, I think, should represent a particularly buoyant market for such services. So that, in brief, although 30 minutes is enough time to talk about anything, that is what this strategy is about. And I very much welcome the chance now to engage with whoever wishes to talk about it. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for I appreciate the time was relatively short, but I think you managed to encapsulate the thrust of what's in the strategy. And look, there's no doubting the ambition within this strategy. I think everybody will agree with that. Just looking at, I suppose, some of the questions coming through there from our viewers, I suppose everybody's wondering, the implementation obviously is going to be crucial here, and how this is the targets. I know there are a number of targets set out in the document around methane and some other environmental indicators. Could you maybe share your thoughts on that next stage of implementation and actually translating this strategy into an action plan and actual change on the ground?
Yeah, there's a very clear recognition that the next stage of implementation is of huge importance. What the strategy in its current form does not have is a detailed program of implementation. It has the principles that it will operate to, which involves, oversight, targets which are to be monitored carefully, and course corrections where necessary. We will have, we're going through this 2-month consultation period now to be finished by mid-June. That will lead to some changes in the strategy, because obviously we should be taking on board comments that people will have made, particularly if they can work towards the improvement of what's in the draft document. But there's also been, and many people may be aware of this, we've sponsored what's called national food dialogues, 4 webinars, which have been very useful, I think, and they're all focused on different elements of the strategy. So we had the one earlier this week, which Maeve Henshin from Teagasc took part in, and we will also be taking into account what they throw up. So the implementation the final version of the document will provide a good deal more detail about the implementation arrangements which are in place, are to be put in place at the oversight level, but equally there are a real sense that the key parties of the involved in drawing up the strategy, the key stakeholders, will each have, if you like, beside them what they are committing to implement.
It's has been widely reported that the environmental pillar represented at the committee did have reservations. I think was that probably the best way to describe it, about some of the level of ambition within the strategy. Where is that at now? And I suppose, where would you like to see that going?
Yeah, well, the environmental pillar pulled out at our meeting on the 25th of February, saying that they didn't feel that their views were being sufficiently taken into account. I think the reality was that we were still at an early draft of the document. I thought that we were moving towards taking their views into account, but in any way, they also signaled when they did pull out that they wanted to keep talking, and they've subsequently had a meeting with the three ministers in the Department of Agriculture and with myself. So there are lines of engagement have been retained. In the first of the National Food Dialogues, their representative from the pillar who had sat on the committee, Karen Teagasc, was on one of the panels, which I think was a very welcome development. And also a few days subsequent to that, they published their own document, which again I think is a very useful contribution to the national debate. In many cases, there are strong elements of overlap between what they were proposing and what is now already in the strategy. There are other elements where there isn't a congruence of support. So I think it remains to be seen what they do. I think very much the door is open for them to rejoin the process. And I do say in my foreword to the document that the ideal situation here is that this agri-food strategy in its final form should achieve a high level of political and societal consensus. That would be the best basis for actually getting it implemented, but it would also be the best basis for Ireland being able to present itself as a really serious, a serious player in working towards this objective of having a sustainable food system, and having that message which is able to say, this is our national policy, we're committed to implementing it, and we want other countries to move in the same direction. And that's the relevance of being able to go to the Food System Summit in September, at which Ireland will be represented by the Taoiseach, and being able to say that and be able to point to our national strategy, signed off, committed to, and committed to being achieved.
Looking at the economic leg of the sustainability stool, I know from speaking to a lot of farmers, they would say, look, there's money, there's cost involved in compliance and improving the environmental standard of their farming systems. There's capital investments and so forth. How do you see in the future how we can send stronger signals through the market to the farm level? Because I know that's one of the ambitions within the strategy, is to have a better distribution of value along the food supply chain. How can we overcome this, I suppose, the cheap food paradigm that we live in at the moment? Is that something that you see as sustainable in the future?
It's very much a matter for debate, I think, and it's becoming an increasing topic for debate, not just in Ireland, but internationally. I mean, first to say that many of the farm representatives around the committee were very clear that they see that they have been asked to achieve higher environmental standards, and it's not being reflected in the price they're getting for what they produce. And there is considerable empirical evidence to support that view. So what we are saying in the strategy is that that needs to be taken account of. If society, European and Irish society, wants this agri-food sector to fully contribute to achieving climate goals, there has to be clarity and greater framework of policy and incentives to assist in that direction, so that farmers if they're being asked to do something, there's a reward for it. And there's a very clear sentiment expressed in the document that the role of the sector is going to have to move from being seen as purely a producer of food. And of course, within that, there's a debate as to what price food should get, but to a producer of goods, of agri-environmental services for which they are paid. So there's a lot of balancing to be done here, and a lot of policy evolution to take place, I think, over the next period of time. But certainly the role of the farmer in contributing in a positive way towards achieving our national climate targets, I think, has to be recognized. I mean, I started out with this exercise by hoping that we could get to the point where we would see the sector as being a positive contributor to the problem of climate change and to its solution. And I think that's very much the spirit in which this document has been written.
No, I think that's very welcome, because I think often when we talk about climate change, we tend to think of the negative or the challenges rather than the opportunities. Pat, we have a lot of questions coming through there, so I better move swiftly to our audience questions. So I'll hand over to
Okay,
Pat.
well, I think the first couple of questions you have mirrored a good number of the ones that we're seeing. But a question here, how can we address much fear that currently permeates the agricultural sector for the future and sustainability, in particular of small farm holdings?
Sorry, Pat, could you repeat that?
How can we address much fear that currently permeates the agricultural sector for their future and their sustainability, and in particular for smaller holdings?
Well, I mean, there's no question this is a very real issue, because, I mean, many smaller farmers, there's some possibilities to improve their welfare through increased efficiency and productivity. And I suppose that's been the business of Teagasc over decades at this stage. But there's equally the realization that some of the answer to this dilemma is through diversifying income sources. And that's where the emphasis on more regional and rural development and technology and broadband, etc., come into play. But there's an age dimension to this, obviously, as well, because for older farmers, it's not going to be as easy to avail of some of these new opportunities. So this is where in the issue of social sustainability in the sector, we are looking at acknowledging those factors, and looking at the needs of older farmers as well. There's this important issues about mental health and loneliness being dealt with also. So I mean, it's around that mix of things, I think, Pat. There's no sort of easy answers to this question, but it is in trying to get a more vibrant and diversified rural economy at the heart of policy, and supporting that, and hoping that that's going to generate more opportunities for people on smaller holdings to actually have a decent farm household income.
Question there, when will the strategy be reviewed to see if it's making matters better or worse? And I suppose the question really is, to what degree are we going to check what's going on an ongoing basis, as opposed to it being a plan that hits the shelf?
Well, certainly, I think the whole idea of having monitoring arrangements in place that assesses what's happening in real time. I mean, you're not going to get every 6 months sort of major changes, but there really does need to be, I would say, in this strategy in particular, we should be thinking about a midterm review. Sort of, it's a strategy for the decade, but by about 2023, 24, I think we would need to see, positive developments in a whole number of areas. And in particular, I think the whole agri-environmental indicators there, that we have to get on a trajectory of change in those, which ensures that we're actually going to achieve the 2030 targets that we're committed to. I think there'll obviously be other measures, indicators of how quickly we're delivering better services in rural areas. The rollout of broadband, for example, is going to be a very practical thing. So I think we should be building in a sort of a culture of continuous review and assessment, and accountability for, are the policies being put in place, and then are they delivering? and do that in a very pragmatic and realistic time frame.
A question here, does the Agri-Food Strategy contain a detailed commitment to the early restoration of Ireland's vanishing biodiversity? And is there an understanding of the ecosystem services required?
I think so. I mean, there'll be debate about this with the environmental pillar as to whether we're going far enough, but there's a very strong section on, I think, on biodiversity. I mean, it's open to debate whether it could be stronger or not, but I think there's a full recognition that the issue of biodiversity is of enormous importance. And I think that recognition is happening now, globally as well. There's I suppose in the last couple of years in particular, the data that's emerging about the number of species that are under threat or are vanishing is very stark. And the whole COVID crisis has also brought into focus the need to make sure that we talk about one world, one welfare, and one health. So there's a very definite recognition of the interconnectedness of things. I think our strategy is fully reflects that, and I think the detail of what is in it, I think also reflects it.
A question here, and again, it might be a difficult one to answer in a very short space of time. What kind of social indicators would you envisage a kind of explaining or demonstrating the success of I suppose social inclusion elements of the plan?
We acknowledge in the document that we're probably not quite there yet in terms of having an agreed set of social indicators to reflect this. But what in saying that social sustainability is actually a really important part of the wider sustainability proposition. We accept that more work needs to be done on that. But I mean, there are certain areas where we should be looking. I mean, there's a strong emphasis, for example, on safety on the farm, where practical things can be done in the short term. There's a strong recognition that the COVID crisis has brought to light, some very positive things in our society and in our rural society about people looking after each other. And we should be building on some of that as well. And if you like, turning it into more agreed measures of how we look to ensuring that social sustainability throughout the country is measured.
Okay, a couple of questions here, very similar. Should farmers be paid for providing ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration for the benefit of the whole community?
We're sending very clear signals in this document that yes is the answer to that question. How it's to be done, I mean, there's a number of examples. I know that you're having, in a couple of weeks' time, you're having Brendan Dunford from the Burren Bio there. Brendan was on our committee, made a major contribution to the committee and to its report. And I think we are, there's a number of particularly the EIP schemes that have been in place over recent years have given some very helpful suggestions as to how policy should move towards enabling farmers to be paid for the provision of ecosystem services. So that's very much a direction of travel that the strategy endorses. And indeed, there's a number of other ideas in there as to how it should be implemented in practice. So I think and then the whole area of carbon farming is still at an early stage in our discussion. But I mean, that's probably going to involve agreeing on where our baseline is in terms of the status of our soils. There's a strong emphasis on soil health and adopting a long-term view of the importance of improving soil health and how you measure that. And all of this connects back into the agenda for carbon sequestration, which I think is going to become a lot more important in the coming decade.
There's a question here just saying you mentioned compromises and that that there was a failure in Food Wise 2025 to, I suppose, to see that compromise between the economic output and environmental sustainability. What do you have in the current proposal that will ensure that I suppose the competing elements of environment and economics delivers on the environmental side?
Well, I think we've tried to be very specific about some of the the direction of travel that we need to see in terms of meeting legitimate agri-environmental objectives. I mean, if you set big targets for a climate neutral society and a climate neutral sector by particular dates, it behoves you then to begin to set intermediate targets. And that's why I think, over the next 3 years in particular, making serious progress on what's spelled out in Ag Climatize is of real importance. But I think there's a wider question here. I think we're going to have to work towards a greater level of understanding, mutual understanding between these two, if you like, sets. Let's call it, to oversimplify it, let's call it between the farmers and the environmentalists. And we need to get to the point where there's a greater level of trust and mutual respect. And that could be the basis then to look forward. It probably has to be done on the basis that there is a clear recognition that the agri-food sector is actually a serious contributor to solving the climate crisis, both in terms of reducing emissions, increasing carbon sequestration, and dealing with renewable energy. But on the other side of the fence, I think there has to be a recognition that there has to be an equivalence between economic, environmental, and social sustainability. We were not asked to produce a strategy which only met the demands of the environment. There is a legitimate economic role, obviously, for the sector as well. And in that context, Ireland's role as a producer of safe, high-quality livestock products, selling to a very large number of 180 countries across the world, that is a legitimate role. And even though we acknowledge that there needs to be reductions in meat consumption in certain parts of the developed world, the reality is that the world needs high-quality protein, animal source protein. And Ireland is in a very good position to produce this in a more sustainable way than many other countries. And so, I mean, getting that understanding that we can reach a degree of mutual respect and tolerance for each other's opinions, that I think should be the way we're looking towards the future. And if that is the case, then I think we could sign off on a really progressive final version of this strategy and go forward together.
Okay, there's a couple of questions there in terms of alignment of our strategy with the EU Farm to Fork, and one that maybe is even suggesting that we should be pushing to go beyond some of the issues in Farm to Fork.
Well, the thing is that Farm to Fork is evolving it's a policy framework, the details of which are going to emerge over the next period of time at European level. I think the value of having a strategy such as we have now is that we're giving very clear signals of our commitment to high-level ambition in this field. So when we, as a country, debate to the more detailed shape of Farm to Fork and of biodiversity and of other aspects of evolving European policy, we have this as a starting point for our discussion. As equally, we have this as a starting point for our discussion in the wider international debate that's emerging. There is no question that the world is bit by bit moving to an acknowledgement that sustainable food systems has to be at the heart of national and international policy. And I think the fact that we have developed our strategy on precisely that basis puts us in a very strong position to contribute to that debate at both EU and international level.
Tom, I've spoken to colleagues in the Netherlands where they have implemented an index for monitoring the environmental performance of the country alongside GDP and other economic indicators. Would you be in favour of something like that in Ireland, where we can, have some sort of a dashboard or a barometer of our performance? I know it's there in maybe more detail, but to actually to bring that to a level where maybe the citizens and that we can actually, I suppose, boast about our performance.
Very definitely. I mean, we say very clearly early in our document that if we are looking at this concept of sustainable food systems, we don't actually have a measurement of it internationally. That's agreed internationally. And we say in the document that we should be advocating for that. And we should be advocating that it should be developed by probably an independent international organization such as the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, and that Ireland should bring its own experience of developing its own strategy and the monitoring and implementation process that it's envisaging to put in place to monitor that strategy to that international consideration. So very definitely, this is for this to happen would, I think, be in the Irish national interest, because if we say we aspire to being a leader in this field, we need a measurement which shows that our actual performance is in keeping with our leadership ambitions.
We're just coming up on time. Pat, do we have any last burning question there?
Yeah, there was I suppose a question about the level of consensus within the very broad group that coming out of the development of the strategy. Have you a very strong consensus within the group, and do you feel that you have a strong consensus between, obviously there's the issues with the environmental pillar, but within all other sectors, how strong do you feel the consensus towards pushing forward with the achievement of the objectives set?
We met in January, in February, and ended up in going through different drafts of the document. When we met at our last meeting, I said that this was an almost final document, and that we would take on board whatever additional comments were being made. I was very struck by the degree of, I thought, genuine consensus around the table. There were, at that stage, not 32 people there, but there were 31 people. And there was a real sense, I think, that we had gone on a journey from January 2020, when we started our work, when we agreed that we should adopt a food systems approach to developing our strategy. There was a real sense that that was the right decision to have made, and that we had delivered on that. There was a sense that we had made a real effort to deliver on getting the balance right between the three dimensions of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social. So I think we have the basis for genuine consensus for the future. I hope that we can, that the environmental pillar can come back and see that there is a great deal of what is in the draft strategy is in fact close to what they have themselves advocated. There's some other areas which probably can be further accommodated, but I think we are on the verge of having what would be a document, first and foremost, important for our own national economic and social interest. But equally, if we can achieve that, that is the basis for really positioning ourselves at an European and international level as being a real visionary for sustainable food systems into the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Mark, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was saying that's a really perfect way to finish the session, I think, Tom. And I think you've really captured the essence of what the strategy is about. I think that phrase, that we can't compartmentalize each component of sustainability, I think that to me is a really important point, that they all have to be looked at collectively, and that even looking at the level within environmental sustainability, we can't just deal with climate change in isolation of biodiversity and water quality. They have to be brought along together. So thank you so much for joining us today, Tom, and I want to wish you well with the remaining work that you have to do there and building that consensus. And I think that's a really important forum for trying to develop that, I suppose, understanding between the different parts or pillars involved in the process. So if people want to contribute to that public consultation, that remains open until the end of the month, is it, Tom, or into June?
Mid-June.
Mid-June. Okay. And I presume it's Department of Agriculture website that they can visit. And there is another, is it one remaining dialogue that's coming up?
One remaining dialogue on the 17th. It's Monday week. I'll be involved in it. It's about the issue of policy coherence between our domestic policy on sustainable food systems and our international and foreign policy. So I think an important matter to discuss.
Great. Thank you. Thank you again, Tom. Pat, thanks very much for helping with questions.
No problem.
Just to remind you that next week we'll be joined by Bernie O'Flaherty from Law Pro, who's going to be talking to us about water quality and the challenges in understanding and valuing it. And like Tom referred to, we'll have Brendan Dunford then the following week, who's going to be talking about the great work that they're doing down in the Burren there also. At that, we'll wrap things up, and we will talk to you again. Thank you.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.